Much has been made of the current Russian troop buildup near Ukraine, but relatively little attention has been paid to the large-scale World War II-style battles that have already occurred between the two sides in the last decade. Ukraine has a long and complicated history, some of which we've covered, from the rise of Kiev to the Mongol incursions to the Cossack interplay with Poland and Russia to Ukraine's sometimes dark place in the Soviet Union to the creation of an independent Ukraine. However, since 2014, a new chapter in Ukrainian history has been opened, and warfare with Russia has been the result, with dismemberment of Ukraine by Russia and now the current crisis being an extension of that. Let's take a look at the present-day demographics, which have changed over time, but not that much. However, when looking at this map, it's important to note that there are Russian-speaking ethnic Ukrainians, as well as Ukrainian-speaking ethnic Russians. The languages are, of course, very similar variants of the East Slavic language, with Russian still being the lingua franca. But since the independence of Ukraine, the Ukrainian language has seen a revival, especially in the heavily ethnic Ukrainian identifying center and west portions of the country. What exactly is the background of the 2014 situation could be said to be the entire history of the region, not just of Ukraine, but also of Crimea, which has a history all its own. Crimea having been the foundation of Greek and Byzantine colonies in the Black Sea, however, eventually coming under the control of Kiev, but then diverging for several more centuries as it came under the control of the Mongols and the Crimean Tatars, before eventually joining the Russian Empire. If we skip ahead to World War I, both Crimea and Ukraine were once again the object of geopolitical power games. Initially, after the February Revolution and the later instatement of a Russian republic, Ukraine and Crimea remained united with Russia. However, after the October Revolution, Ukraine became independent, eventually becoming a German client state under the Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky, while the Crimean Tatars at first remained under the control of the classicalist Russian government before declaring their own independence. This was quickly followed, however, by a Soviet-Russian-backed Bolshevik coup in which a communist Taurida Soviet Socialist Republic was set up. However, they were driven out by the Germans in Operation Crimea in 1918. Crimea and the crucial naval port of Sevastopol became a protectorate of the German military and later became a German client state, the Crimean Regional Government, under former Russian General Sulkowitz. Meanwhile, the rest of Ukraine remained a separate German client state under Skoropadsky. Later in 1918, as seen in our documentary about the collapse of Austria-Hungary, a West Ukrainian state was set up in Lviv, while several even smaller Ruthene states were set up elsewhere in eastern and central Galicia. None of the Ukrainian or Ruthenian polities in this period would end up being long-lived. In November 1918, after the German defeat in France, Germany was forced to abandon its support of the Ukrainian and Crimean states. Both the Crimea and southwestern Ukraine, including Odessa, was then occupied by the Allied forces led by the French, but also including a significant contingent of Greek forces. The French briefly held Odessa under military administration while utilizing the existing Crimean regional government that had been set up as a German client, replacing General Sulkowitz with civil servant Solomon Krim. However, after poor coordination between the Allied forces in the south of Ukraine and Crimea, the Allies withdrew from the area in April of 1919 and falling once again briefly to Bolshevik control later in the year. As the smaller Ruthene states in Galicia were annexed by Poland and Czechoslovakia, the Lviv and Kiev regimes merged, yet found themselves fighting a three-front war for their existence, sandwiched between Poland, the Communist Russians, and the Classicalist Russians. There was also a significant anarchist breakaway region in the southeast along the Sea of Azov. By 1920, virtually all of Ukraine was in the hands of the Soviets, though in the west there continued to be a tussle over Galicia as part of the ongoing Polish-Soviet War. Meanwhile, the Crimea was the last holdout in the south for the Russian White Army, which had set up a series of short-lived classicalist governments at Sevastopol, the harbor at which has long been the grand prize of Crimea. However, it would soon become that for the communist Russians instead, as they would capture Crimea permanently this time in November of 1920. Earlier that year, Kiev, which had been tossed between multiple factions on almost a dozen occasions during the years following World War I, was also permanently captured by the Soviets from the Polish. Crimea became an autonomous region of the Russian Soviet Republic, while Ukraine was at first a nominally independent Soviet puppet state, which then in 1922, alongside the Russian Soviet Republic, signed the Treaty on the Creation of the Soviet Union. This began began the long odyssey of Ukraine and Crimea under communist rule. In the 1930s, under the control of Stalin, Soviet agricultural policy, which was designed for social engineering, devastated Ukrainian peasants, killing millions of Ukrainians along with Jews and other landholders. This engineered famine is often labeled a genocide and is commonly known as the Holodomor. Much of the Ukrainian anger was not just directed at the communist authorities, but at that time across Europe, political opinion had become anti-Semitic, tying Jewish populations to the rise of communism. In Ukraine, this is despite the victimization of Jewish landowners just as much as ethnic Ukrainians by the communist authorities. Though amongst many of the poorer Ukrainian peasants, anti-Semitism against these landowners and businessmen was already pervasive even prior to the rise of communism. The growing anti-Semitism that accompanied the anti-communist sentiment in the 1930s, during and after the hunger famine, would be manifest in ugly ways following the German invasion of the area a decade later. The Germans set up a settlement colony in the Ukraine under the partial purview of administrators from East Prussia. Meanwhile, when the Germans eventually captured Crimea, a military administration was set up, and after the successful siege of Sevastopol, for the second time in 2 decades, the Germans would base their naval facilities at the city. Meanwhile, ethnic Ukrainians, many of whom were sympathetic to the anti-communism promoted by the Germans, and some of whom were sympathetic to their anti-Semitism as well, formed numerous units to assist the German armed forces in their campaigns in the east. This did not involve frontline action and mostly included anti-partisan activities in Polish and Ruthenian cities. Perhaps most infamously, Ukrainians formed a large part of the force which the Germans used to do the dirtiest jobs at their execution centers. After the Soviet Union recaptured the area in 1944, thousands of Ukrainians were deported to Siberia for suspected collaboration with the enemy during the German occupation. None were more affected than the Crimean Tatars, who saw between 1/3 and 1/2 of their total population deported by Stalin's NKVD to the Uzbek steppes. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians waged an 8-year-long insurgency after having declared their intent on independence as the Germans retreated at the end of the Second World War. This would be largely crushed, however, by 1953. When Khrushchev later came to power in the Soviet Union, the Crimean Tatars were not allowed to move back, but in a general change of directions in Soviet policy overall, Khrushchev, who had spent a large portion of his life in Ukraine, including being a political commissar during the Second World War, when the communists had briefly lost control over Ukraine for several years, decided to unilaterally transfer Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian one. Within the internal politics of the Soviet Union, this was essentially a formality, and it had no real effect, as the Soviet Union, despite being a nominal federation, was essentially governed centrally from Moscow.
Ukraine would become fully independent after the collapse of the communist system and the Soviet Union in late 1991. Ukraine, along with Belarus and Kazakhstan, had inherited thousands of nuclear weapons from the Soviet arsenal. However, all the launch codes were still possessed by the Russian military. That being said, while the Kazakhs and Belarusians gave up their nuclear weapons without contest, Ukraine was not so apt. The naval base at Sevastopol was still as valuable as ever, and it, along with the nuclear weapons, served as a bargaining chip with Russia. At the time, there was a spirit of cooperation as both Russia and Ukraine were moving closer to Western Europe, as both were newly returned to classicalist politics and capitalist economics, and both were also emerging as weakened entities after the Soviet collapse, attempting to build themselves back up. These mutual interests led to the signing of the Budapest Memorandum on December 5, 1994. This also looped in Belarus and Kazakhstan, as well as America and Britain as quasi-guarantors. Ukraine agreed to surrender its nuclear weapons, and in return Russia would respect its current territorial borders, while America, Britain, and Russia would each help to deter attacks on the soil of Ukraine. Despite the 3 great nuclear powers being signees and again quasi-guarantors, there was no legally binding obligation nor treaty guarantee. Both American and British politicians believed that a legally binding guarantee to defend Ukrainian sovereignty was unlikely to be ratified by the legislatures in each country. However, this, at least ostensibly, seemed to settle most of the issues between Russia and Ukraine, with the one outstanding issue of the Sevastopol harbor being settled 3 years later, when the Black Sea Fleet Partition Treaty was signed on May 28, 1997. This guaranteed the continued status of Crimea as an autonomous republic of the state of Ukraine, while Russia paid $526 million to take over 81% of the Black Sea Fleet, and also agreed to pay $97 million annually to lease the naval base at Sevastopol. Meanwhile, the city of Sevastopol itself, which has always been administered separately from the rest of the Crimea, was also to remain a part of Ukraine, alongside the Crimea. By the time the naval treaty took effect in 1999, the Russian government led by Boris Yeltsin that had overseen these deals was on its way out. Yeltsin had become deeply unpopular, as throughout this entire decade Russia was undergoing painful economic hardships as the newly classicalist state transitioned to mostly capitalist economic practices. Ukraine was also going through many of those same issues during this time, as were other post-communist countries, something that continues to be a problem up through the present day. However, Russia, which was struggling to deal with separatism in the Caucasus and other Islamist activity within its borders, this was especially manifest, something that allowed Vladimir Putin to rise to power on the back of the Russian victory in the Second Chechen War in 1999. After Yeltsin appointed him president, Putin at first continued Yeltsin's foreign policies while focusing on mainly domestic concerns, as he increased his popularity by taking out the oligarchs that had seemingly run the country into the ground in the 1990s. Of course, Putin was no less corrupt and essentially replaced them with his own loyalists. Putin's continuation of Yeltsin's foreign policy, which was largely pro-American and had seen Russia even consider joining NATO in 1999 and 2000, essentially until the fallout from the Kosovo War, Russia continued to be viewed both by America and Britain and by Ukraine as an ally. This led to the June 2001 meeting between Putin and American President George W. Bush at Crawford Ranch, after which Bush remarked that Putin appeared trustworthy and that he had, quote, seen the man's soul. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine were at this point still on fairly good terms. The trouble really started in 2004. A new president was set to be elected for the first time in a decade, and it saw the largely pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych opposed by the largely pro-European Union Viktor Yushchenko. Although both men were unpopular and seen as corrupt symbols of the new oligarchic establishment, the election was hugely important for the foreign policy implications that its outcome would bear, given the stark difference in the two positions. The initial election was so close that it would require 2 runoff attempts. In September of 2004, Yushchenko was poisoned by dioxin. He would later accuse several specific figures associated with the Russian security forces of carrying this out. While the pro-EU Yushchenko was nursed back to health in Germany, the pro-Russian Yanukovych was declared the winner. However, he was accused by Yushchenko's team and also observers of committing massive election fraud. This led to a protest movement known as the Orange Revolution, which was supported by Western European countries. The Ukrainian Supreme Court ordered a revote. This time, Yushchenko was the winner, causing a deep rift with Yanukovych and the pro-Russian factions within Ukraine and with the Russian Federation itself. Russia would begin using oil and gas diplomacy to undermine the Yushchenko government over the next 5 years. Meanwhile, relations between America and Russia directly began to deteriorate the same year as several ex-Warsaw Pact members joined the NATO alliance. Putin, who was attempting to promote the rise of several pro-Russian leaders in Central and Eastern Europe, claimed that this was a violation of oral agreements made between America and Russia in the early 1990s that NATO would not expand past its then frontiers in Germany. However, no such agreement was ever ratified in ink, and it had merely been thrown around in discussions after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and over the course of Yeltsin's presidency, he would eventually accede to NATO expansion, and as mentioned earlier, even at one point considered joining it. Russia no longer wanted to join, but with NATO expansion underway, this now clashed with Putin's new goal of re-establishing a Russian sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe, most especially over the countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union itself, and within that, most importantly, Belarus and Ukraine. The next year, Putin referred to the collapse of the Soviet Union as the, quote, greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This quote has been somewhat misinterpreted over the years, as Putin, despite growing up in the KGB, has no love for the communist system and is an ardent classicalist, bringing back the Russian Orthodox Church in force and promoting pre-communist Russian traditions such as the Cossack brigades. So instead, what Putin seems to lament about the Soviet collapse is the fact that the collapse ended a Moscow-based state in control of Russia, Ukraine, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Baltics, and with a sphere of influence projecting far beyond that. Thus, Putin's real desire is not to bring back the communist Soviet Union, but instead to revive a classicalist Russian Empire. One way of extending Russian influence into neighboring countries has been the establishment of puppet republics on the territories of opposing regimes, thus giving Russia both leverage and a sense of military control over its neighbors. This even predated Putin in places, with the beginnings of the Abkhazia and South Ossetia breakaway regions in the early 1990s following the Soviet collapse, with especially Abkhazia being a former KGB haven during the Soviet days, while Transnistria in the west, a haven for the Soviet military, broke away from Moldova around the same time. Under Putin, this only intensified, as the Caucasus nation of Georgia was attempting to join NATO and the EU in 2008, Russia, still incensed by the recognition of Kosovo independence by several American allies earlier in the year, began saber-rattling. The Georgian president, Saakashvili, then miscalculated and thought he had American and British diplomatic support to retake South Ossetia. In fact, he did find support in some areas of the White House. However, President Bush decided against sending heavy military assistance, and thus the Russian counterattack not only secured the breakaway republic, but also invaded the rest of Georgia and eventually forced Tbilisi to surrender. After this victory, the Russian Federation would grant official diplomatic recognition to the two breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, with Russia also maintaining a naval base in Abkhazia, thus solidifying a small Russian sphere of influence in the region, while also keeping leverage over the pro-American government of Georgia, which is essentially precluded from joining military alliances because of the breakaway republics. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the pro-Russian Yanukovych, ousted by the Orange Revolution in 2004 after the vote-rigging scandal, would be legitimately elected the president of Ukraine in 2010. Yanukovych hails from the Russian-speaking Donetsk region of the east, a resource-rich region part of the Donetsk River Basin, or the Donbas. Through the transition in power in Kiev, negotiations were ongoing with Brussels for an agreement of association with the European Union. After Yanukovych came to power, the negotiations did continue, despite various impasses and disagreements. However, the draft resolution continued to be worked on by both sides throughout 2012 and into early 2013. As negotiations continued, Russia enacted numerous trade restrictions on Ukraine, essentially starting a trade war in the summer of 2013, attempting to get Yanukovych to back off from the path of the EU association agreement. The pro-Russian Yanukovych eventually did cancel the agreement on November 21st. This sparked an immediate crisis in Ukraine as large public demonstrations erupted, some of which devolved into violent clashes with Ukrainian security forces. As the movement grew, Yanukovych ordered it to be put down by any means necessary, resulting in essentially street fighting on the Maidan Square in central Kiev. That led this crisis to be known as the Euromaidan crisis. Now, all that was going on in Kiev and the northwest portion of the country. In the south and east, opinions were different, and Yanukovych had much higher levels of support, especially in the Donbas. The crisis would continue for a full 3 months. On February 21st, both parties finally signed an agreement to prevent a potential civil war in the country. However, as it would later turn out, this would be just the starting point for the future warfare in Ukraine. In fact, even in the moments after the agreement was signed, the street fighting did continue. The agreement dictated the formation of a caretaker government, one in which Yanukovych's future was unclear. The very next day after the agreement was signed, February 22nd, an impeachment vote took place in the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament. 73% of MPs voted to remove Yanukovych and to schedule early presidential elections for May 25th. Yanukovych subsequently disavowed the agreement he'd signed and the impeachment, making the case that he was still the legally elected president of Ukraine and that this was a pro-Western coup. Putin immediately sprang into action, sending Russian special forces units to guard Yanukovych and move him from Kiev to friendly territory, first in Kharkiv, then in Crimea, and eventually at Rostov in Russia, with Yanukovych remaining in exile in Moscow to this day. On these same days in late February, Russian military intelligence, the GRU, began encouraging pro-Russian demonstrations in the south and east, especially in Crimea. The Russians also began to
ship in military hardware to their naval base in Sevastopol. On February 26th, Russian troops from Novorossiysk set up checkpoints along the main roads from the Kerch Peninsula to Sevastopol. Although these checkpoints flew the Russian flag, there were no insignias on the uniforms of the men, and they claimed to be local volunteers. At the same time, Russia denied any involvement in Crimea, saying that this was a spontaneous local action. From this attempt at anonymity, the Russian special forces would get the nickname Little Green Men. 60 Little Green Men seized the Crimean parliament. The next day, the unmarked Russian special forces captured the airports of both Sevastopol and Simferopol, the latter being the Crimean capital, with Sevastopol having always been administered separately. In eastern Crimea, the Russians seized the old Greco-Roman city of Feodosia, with the Ukrainian defenders in the city surrounded by multiple Russian pincers. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Navy's last holdouts in Sevastopol were under siege. On March 4th, Putin once again denied that any of the soldiers in Crimea were in fact Russian troops. However, in Ukraine and around the world, Russian troop presence had essentially already been confirmed, but Putin would not abandon his pretext and would in fact double down on it. With Russian special forces still in control of the Crimean parliament, they would vote on March 6 to officially request annexation by the Russian Federation. As expected, this passed, and 5 days later, on the 11th, the Crimean parliament declared the Republic of Crimea to be an independent state. The city of Sevastopol also joined the new republic. Thus, it was the entire peninsula that would vote on the March 16th referendum, again overseen by Russian special forces, for the newly independent Republic of Crimea to request formal annexation into the Russian Federation, which had of course already been voted on by the parliament itself. This passed with 95% of the vote. However, outside of Russia and its allies, the vote was unrecognized by the rest of the world given the circumstances it was held under. And thus, that was also the case for the official March 18th accession of Crimea to the Russian Federation as a federal subject with republic status, along with the accession of Sevastopol as a Russian federal city. In fact, the only entities that did recognize this were Russia's other breakaway puppet states, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. However, Crimea was the first of its kind to be officially annexed into the Russian Federation. As economic and trade sanctions went into effect on Russia from numerous parties, the Russian propaganda machine went on a full-scale offensive, attempting to convince as many in the world as possible that its invasion and annexation of Crimea had been justified. This led to the production of a somewhat bizarre propaganda video. Many Russian state-backed outlets attempt to gain legitimacy by imitating various American styles of presentation. This includes the way that news programs and graphics are formatted, and the co-option and imitation of American pop culture for the purpose of legitimizing Russian government actions. This is a common tactic in Russian domestic politics, where the use of American and British-style culture grants a sense of social legitimacy that, for example, the Soviet regime never had. But Putin's more classicalist approach, and the lack of being tied to communist ideology, has given the Russian propaganda industry a much freer hand. In the case of Crimea, Putin was attempting to convince both his own population and the rest of the world that there should be nothing controversial about it, and that everyone in Crimea is happy and relieved to be a part of Russia. Though to be fair, a large number of Crimeans were indeed happy with the outcome. This was done by producing a music video in Sevastopol. In this video, the Russian national anthem is sung, and the video essentially attempts to imitate the production style of various American concerts and music shows in the mid-2000s. For example, a stage design similar to that of American Idol, a mosh pit, and choreographing various trademark elements of those shows and concerts, hands swaying in unison, enthusiastic children, the typical patriotic but hesitant to sing in public athlete, and numerous other crowd shot stereotypes from American and British television shows, all wrapped up by a multi-ethnic group of lead singers attempting to pander to American and British sensibilities about diversity. And in fact, Russia is an extremely diverse country with over 100 ethnic groups, before finishing with more stereotypical elements of Russian propaganda videos, such as a deep bass voice, as well as an overly passionate voice. This type of over-the-top propaganda was a main factor in holding the Soviet Union together, and this video was one of the most over-the-top produced by the Russians in decades, and is comparable to the final scenes of Stalin's Fall of Berlin in its over-the-top and hyperbolic nature. And remember, this was just weeks after Russia was denying that they in fact had any presence in Crimea. Meanwhile, in the Donbas in early April, GRU and FSB-affiliated operatives worked with local pro-Russian protesters to seize government buildings in Donetsk. After the seizures on April 6th, Ukraine sent in special internal police, which recaptured the buildings for Ukraine the next day. The buildings were retaken on April 12th by FSB and GRU-affiliated forces, who the same day also seized Ukrainian government buildings in Sloviansk. The fighters had already declared the formation of the Donetsk People's Republic. Reportedly, these events were being directed by forces adjacent to the Kremlin. The next day, April 13th, Ukrainian forces counterattacked in Sloviansk. This effectively marked the start of true military conflict, with Crimea having been annexed without any real battles. The Donbas would be different and would result in war between Russia and Ukraine. For now, though, it was just between Ukraine and the Russian-backed separatists, again led by former Russian GRU, who had declared their intent, under self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic President Denis Pushilin, to hold their own Crimea-style referendum regarding accession to the Russian Federation. Although this would eventually be postponed, it displays the thinking and the intent of the separatist entities. However, the war continued to expand. By the end of May, the Russian-backed Donetsk forces had seized Mariupol and were attempting to connect it to the rest of their territory. Meanwhile, in the north, a new group of Russian-backed separatists had captured Luhansk and had proclaimed the Luhansk People's Republic. Russia also sent operatives to conduct similar operations in other cities. These included Kharkov, where the declaration of a Kharkov People's Republic saw short-lived success. However, the Ukrainian forces soon pushed the Russian operatives and their local supporters out of the town. An attempt was also made in Odessa, where major clashes left 46 would-be insurgents dead. As fighting raged throughout the summer, the civilian population would suffer immensely. The Russian-backed troops were known to fire missiles from civilian neighborhoods, then move their equipment out of harm's way before the counter-barrage began, leaving civilians to take the brunt of the attacks as human shields. As the leadership of the so-called republics remained contested, various warlords took regional control over their territories, simply paying lip service to the authorities in Donetsk and Luhansk. These warlords were known for extortion, random acts of violence, and even enslavement of civilians who were put to work in the by now shut down coal mines and industrial plants of Donbas. In fact, throughout the summer, violence between warlords and between different separatist factions continued to occur. They began to run out of steam. By the 16th of June, Ukraine had recaptured Mariupol. Meanwhile, large-scale fighting was ongoing for control of the Donetsk airport, that despite a first ceasefire attempt by Europe. Ukraine held the airport for now, although much larger-scale fighting was to come at the same location. Also at this time, Russia sent their first regular forces into the fight, as after several days of speculation and denials by the Russian government, Pushilin confirmed the presence of Russian tanks in Donetsk. Like in Crimea, the Russians wore no insignia on their uniforms, while their tanks had all insignias painted over. However, this limited Russian help was not enough to stop the Ukrainian momentum, and the Russian-backed forces continued to lose ground.
The two People's Republics, for their part, had announced a merge into the Novorossiya Confederation, which was to take place after negotiations between the two entities. Presumably, this new confederation would then request its annexation into Russia as a whole. However, the old Russian governorate of Novorossiya included more than just the Donbas. It included the entire southern and eastern portions of Ukraine, from Donetsk in the east all the way to Odessa in the west. Whether this was indeed the final intent of these moves is not known, nor would the confederation come to pass, even between Donetsk and Luhansk, due to the Russian proxy's biggest mistake yet. On July 17th, elements of the Donetsk People's Republic, operating a Russian-provided Buk missile system, announced via social media that they had shot down a Ukrainian cargo plane. However, it would later turn out that this was a civilian airliner, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. All 293 people on board were killed. As international outrage poured down on the two separatist entities, preventing their confederation and encouraging Ukrainian resolve to take back the territory, Russia began to take advantage of the plausible deniability that they had created from the beginning. Thus, no confederation and annexation to Russia was on the table, as Russia was forced, at least publicly, to deny all connection with the two entities, and could not annex them without essentially taking responsibility for the plane tragedy. Now, at the same time, Russia's propaganda outlets did come up with an alternative theory for the shootdown and spread that disinformation, but the situation was so tense that Russia understood in the eyes of the world it would be taking responsibility for the plane shootdown if it was to acknowledge any affiliation with the Donbas republics. What did concern Russia was their loss of territory and disorganized nature. Thus, while fully denying any affiliation with the republics or with their military operations, Russia sent a huge force of thousands of little green men and little green tanks into the area. These were Russian regular forces, and they pushed across to Donetsk, forming a pincer with the rebel forces in Donetsk, and thus putting a large Ukrainian force at Ilovaisk into the cauldron of an encirclement. Over 1,000 Ukrainian troops now found themselves entrapped and encircled by Russian tanks. Ukraine launched a breakout attempt the next day. However, the relief force was destroyed by a Russian paratrooper attack. Despite completely denying any Russian involvement in these battles, Vladimir Putin still got publicly involved on August 29th when he announced the creation of a humanitarian corridor for the Ukrainian soldiers if they would surrender. The same day, new Donetsk People's Republic leader Alexander Zakharchenko, a local from Donbas, announced that the said ceasefire had gone into effect and that Ukraine had agreed to fly the white flag and retreat out of two pre-designated quote-unquote humanitarian corridors on their hour-long drive back to Ukrainian lines. However, this would not be honored, and both long Ukrainian columns of 60 vehicles plus were ambushed by Russian forces. For the Ukrainian army, overall the Battle of Ilovaisk would result in 700 to 1,000 casualties, including hundreds killed. And that's without even mentioning the civilian humanitarian impact of such large-scale fighting on residential areas. Over the next weeks, another massive battle began to rage, the Second Battle of the Donetsk airport, with Russian regulars now involved. Intense shelling and tank warfare would take place around the airport and its associated facilities. The battle turned into a stalemate, especially after a ceasefire was declared in September, and thus with both sides in the airport area constantly shelling each other, the infrastructure that both sides were attempting to capture was essentially useless, with the airport totally destroyed. However, the strategic military importance of such a facility is significant even if the facility is destroyed, and thus the battle continued to rage for several more months. Despite the ceasefire attempt, fighting continued throughout the fall, though few advances were made during this time due to the biannual Rasputitsa, the heavy spring and fall rains that turn the countryside to mud, and which mostly limit large-scale military operations in Eastern Europe to summer and winter offensives, when the ground is either baked out or frozen. Russia was attempting to eliminate the Ukrainian presence across various salients in the Donbas. By January 15th, the fighting at the airport was over. The Russian-backed Donetsk forces had pushed the Ukrainians completely out of the now destroyed airport. Donetsk leader Alexander Zakharchenko declared victory. Following the renewed fighting at the airport, a new ceasefire attempt was brokered by the European powers. It, like the first ceasefire, did not stop the fighting, at least immediately.
The Russians were attempting to eliminate the last salient of Ukrainian control, which presented the threat of splitting the Donbas in two. The key component of this Ukrainian position was the city of Debaltsevo. At the time of the ceasefire, the Russians had surrounded and were besieging the city. The humanitarian situation inside the Debaltsevo cauldron was dire. The Russian-backed forces announced that anyone attempting to flee this kettle would end up in the crosshairs of Russian artillery. Meanwhile, heavy shelling had reduced the formerly vibrant city to ruins. This time, up to 6,000 Ukrainian troops were trapped inside, along with the civilians. Like at Ilovaisk, poor logistics and communication on the part of the Ukrainian army led to the trapped forces remaining encircled for over 2 weeks. The Russian forces finally entered the city itself on February 17th, and the next day, Ukrainian forces began attempting to retreat and break out towards their lines to the north and west. However, this was largely a disaster, with Ukraine suffering another 900+ casualties, including 267 killed. With Russian-backed forces now in control of a defensible territorial unit, Moscow would order the separatists to honor the ceasefire once the Battle of Debaltsevo had been won. Thus, the Minsk II Accords became the basis for all future peace talks. However, even as the conflict became a frozen conflict, somewhat akin to Abkhazia, South Ossetia, or Transnistria, this frozen conflict over the next 8 years was more like the Azeri-Armenian conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, in which even the frozen conflict stage continued the shelling, sniping, and civilian and military casualties along the front lines. Although Russia had done much to shore up the internal security of the breakaway republics, which effectively were transformed from ragtag entities to Russian puppet states, it appears that some internal power struggles may have continued. In 2018, while eating at a cafe in Donetsk, Donbas local and Donetsk People's Republic leader Alexander Zakharchenko was assassinated via a bomb that was planted in the restaurant. It remains unclear, even to this day, who was behind this assassination. In any case, Pushilin, closer to the Kremlin than Zakharchenko anyway, returned to replace him. In 2018, Russia secured its connection to Crimea. The peninsula's only natural land link is with the now cut-off Ukraine, which also supplied much of Crimea's fresh water. Russia got around this by constructing a bridge over the Kerch Strait. Previously, during the Second World War, the Germans and Soviets had each attempted construction of a bridge over the strait, but both had been short-lived. This new connection not only secured Russia's political connection to Crimea, but also shored up the peninsula's economic interests and tied them directly to Russia. With road and rail links now available to the peninsula, commercial and tourist activity from Russia has increased, although the water supply issue has not yet been solved, and in fact continued to get worse each year, with Ukraine continuing to cut off the canal in the northern Perekop Isthmus and forcing Russia to come up with alternative water supply plans over the Kerch Peninsula. As time passed since the Malaysian Airlines shootdown, Russia began to make incremental moves towards a new campaign. There were several instances of major saber-rattling on Ukraine's borders between 2019 and 2021, only for Russia to conduct military drills with Belarus and then withdraw. Initially, that appeared to be the case in 2022. However, Western sources kept insisting that they had specific intelligence this was a real Russian invasion force, and negotiations began early in 2022 with Putin. Many assumed that this was just another instance of saber-rattling, or at the most, the Kremlin was going to bite off another chunk of Ukraine and continue to dismember the country bit by bit. This appeared initially to be the case on February 21st, when reports began to emerge that Vladimir Putin intended to diplomatically recognize the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. Importantly, both entities claimed the entirety of the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces of Ukraine, despite only controlling a portion of each. Thus, the Mutual Defense Pact that Russia signed with the now recognized republics essentially authorized the Russian military to assist Donetsk and Luhansk in conquering the remainder of their claimed territory. However, on that day, Vladimir Putin made a major speech in Moscow. From this speech, it was crystal clear that Putin's eyes were fixated on more than just Donetsk and Luhansk, and that Kiev was potentially in the crosshairs. We will absolutely be back to cover the current ongoing warfare, to both look at the geopolitical implications and map the conflict itself. So we'll be back with that update on the current war situation, and of course our thoughts are with all of the civilians affected. For now, I hope I was able to provide some background to the situation and put the current war into context. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and if you can, donate on Patreon. Also, make sure to check out the project that forms the basis for these videos, apoliticalworldmap.org. Thanks again for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.